I am Anna Seewald, and this is Authentic Parenting, a podcast about personal development in the context of parenting, where I explore how you can find more calm, connection, and joy in parenting through the process of self-discovery and inner growth with a trauma-informed lens. The COVID-19 pandemic is changing nearly every aspect of our daily lives. As much as we yearn for a quote-unquote normal, disruption will be here to stay. We must evolve, and we can learn about the 5 shifts in agility that will help us thrive, not just survive in the times of disruption. Based on neuroscience-backed research, agility is already a hardwired trait in each of us. In January 2020, my guest had an experience that shook her viscerally. She happened to walk into a virtual reality experiment where she was handed a seed and told she would experience what's like to be a tree. That was a transformative experience for her. Hannah Inam is the CEO of Transformational Leadership, Inc. and a former C-level executive with Fortune 500 companies. She's a sought-after speaker and author of 2 books. Her first book, Wired for Authenticity, and her newest book, Wired for Disruption, a book that helps leaders master the 5 shifts in agility to lead in the future of work. Hannah is a trusted executive coach to C-suite leaders globally. She received her MBA from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania and completed executive education programs at the Harvard Business School. Her LinkedIn learning courses have been viewed by over 300,000 leaders around the world. Hannah brings significant global experience. She lived and worked in 7 countries across 4 continents. If you're like me, then you like fun quizzes. There are 2. Number 1 is based on the research outlined in her first book, Wired for Authenticity, the Authenticity Assessment, and the second one is based on her second book, The Agility Quiz. I will have links for both of these in the show notes. In this episode, we also talk about authenticity, the benefits of being your authentic self, and the 7 practices of authenticity. Number 1, befriend your body. Number 2, stay curious. Number 3, let go. Number 4, give yourself an A. Number 5, choose be before do. Number 6, face the dragon. And number 7, dance with the dream. I really love what Hannah has to say about this topic. For full episode show notes, additional free resources on parenting, contact info, and ways to work with me, visit authenticparenting.com. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. Let's get social. Take a screenshot of this episode and share it on your channels. Tag me and I'll reshare your post and give you a shout out. Disruptions are opportunities to reimagine, reinvent, and reinvigorate to create something better. We have many collective problems to solve for a thriving planet that works better for all. Wired for Disruption helps each of us be inspired agents of change, use our voice, and activate the embedded agility already within us. Please enjoy this thought-provoking conversation with Hannah Inam. Hannah, welcome to the Authentic Parenting Podcast.
Thank you. I look forward to our conversation.
Me too. So I have a secret to tell you. I have this little notebook. Ever since I started the podcast, I've been writing names of possible potential guests, people that I admire, read their books or heard them speak somewhere. And you are one of them in that list. Since 2016, I wanted to have you on the podcast. And finally,
wow.
so many years later, 4 years later, you're finally here. I finally reached out. I had the courage to reach out to you.
Well, thank you. I'm so glad that you reached out and I'm looking forward to this conversation. I had no idea I was in your little black book.
I heard you speak. I heard your interview on another podcast, the Art of Authenticity podcast with Laura Coe. And Laura has been a past guest on my podcast.
Wonderful. Wow.
So, of course, your first book is called Wired for Authenticity, and you have a new book. Why don't you tell us about the new book first?
Yeah. So my new book, which I actually wrote during COVID times, I literally sat down and started writing it in mid-March because I was so inspired and felt like I needed to do something to make a contribution during these times. And it was available on Amazon on June 1st. So it took me about 3 months to write the book. And it's a short book. It's called Wired for Disruption. And it's about the 5 shifts in agility that we all need to make in order to not just survive, but thrive in times of disruption. And the whole notion of the book is that we have it in our DNA as human beings, all of us, and it's within our control for us to be able to thrive in these times. And that the book actually lays out these 5 shifts in agility and 15 accelerators, which are very quick tools that anybody can use in their day-to-day environment and their work environment to become more agile.
Wow, that's some great use of your time. I feel really less accomplished about myself now because during this COVID-19 time, I only binged on Netflix shows.
Well, I did some of that too, just to be clear.
Yes. No, you are a super achiever. I will post your full bio and your website and links. That's one of the things that I admire about you. You are a super achiever, high performer, but you also talk about authenticity and live it and practice and embrace it. That's what I love about you. So tell me a little bit about the 5 points of the agility and what is this time of disruption? It's here to stay, right? You say?
Yeah. So everything that I am listening to and reading, and I also sit on the board of a large publicly traded company. All the conversations that I'm having with my clients who are executive coaching clients and their companies, what I'm seeing is while many of us want to and are yearning for some kind of normal to return, this particular pandemic has created fairly significant shifts, fundamental shifts. It's created shifts in our buying behavior. So if you think about it, we're buying more digitally. And in fact, the CEO of Microsoft, Satya Nadella, talked about in their investor call how digital disruption has actually been accelerated for about 10 years now as a result of this pandemic. So we're going to continue to see digital disruption. Consumer habits have changed. There's a lot of companies that have pivoted very quickly. So many companies pivoted to creating PPEs, hand sanitizers. A lot of consumer packaged goods companies have figured out how to do that. People have figured out how to create new ways of responding to this crisis. Pandemic teams have come together to do emergency and business continuity planning. And so I think that as a result of all of this, disruption is here to stay. And so I talk about these 5 shifts in agility. The first shift that I talk about is neuroemotional agility. There's this challenge that we as human beings face. Anytime that we feel a significant threat, and this pandemic has created significant health threats for us, it has created emotional threats for us, of course, as we worry about what's going to happen to our safety. And it's created economic threats for us. So many of us are out of jobs and there's unemployment and we fear for our jobs. And so there's notion that when we get into threat mode, our body tends to get into this fight, flight, or freeze syndrome. And many of my clients have felt that, and many of them are dealing with that on their teams. And so the research that I've done and the tools that I talk about is this notion of neuroemotional agility, which is the ability to activate neural states that actually accelerate our adaptability. It's from the work that has been done by Dr. Richard Boyatzis. He's written a fantastic book called Helping People Change. And in that work and through 25 years of science research as well as fMRIs, what he has found is that our brain and body operate in 2 separate networks. The one is called the analytic neural network. The other is called the empathic neural network. And what his research has shown is that these two networks are kind of like a seesaw. So when we're in a task-focused, problem-solving, analytic neural network, we're actually not in the empathic neural network. And what the research suggests is when we are actually in the empathic neural network, we feel more connected to others. We are more curious. We're able to be more open to new ideas and change and be more agile than when we're in our task-focused analytic network. And so the book, when I talk about neuroemotional agility, it's really about how do we shift ourselves and how do we create the conditions for shifting others in this fight, flight, freeze pattern and move toward greater contribution, move toward greater empathy. And we can do that. It's part of our DNA.
And how can we do that?
So there's 3 tools that I share that are very specific and very well researched. So the first tool is the tool of self-compassion, and it's a mindfulness-based tool. And this tool is all about, really getting in touch with what's happening right now within our mind body. What's the emotion I'm feeling? And it's completely normal when we feel under threat that we go through an actual change curve. Any kind of disruption creates this change curve. It's called the Hubler-Ross change curve, where our performance and our energy actually goes down. We go through almost this grieving process, like we're grieving the loss of the old, or we're grieving the loss of something that was predictable. And we go through sort of denial and then anger and sort of feelings of grief, and until we find meaning and integrate that experience into, our identity, really. And so this neuroemotional agility, the tool of self-compassion, actually helps us get present to what's happening now, to offer ourselves some kindness. And, there's been a lot of research, over 2,600 studies that have been done around self-compassion. And in fact, on my podcast, which is also something I started right when I wrote the book, I wanted to write a very, very short book because nobody's got time to read, dense books. But I wanted to have a podcast so that I could talk to experts around each of these areas so that anybody who wanted to go deeper could actually learn. And so I interviewed Kristen Neff, who's an expert in self-compassion. And the self-compassion tool that I have on the podcast, as well as in the book, is really about becoming present to our emotions and treating ourselves with real kindness and empathy like we would a good friend. And then being able to offer that compassion to other people in our team, people in our families, to come from a place of real acceptance and kindness. And that actually shifts us. That actually gets us into a place of the empathic neural network where we're able to create a much safer place for others, but also create a much more agile, curious, and creative place for ourselves.
Before you get to the second tool, I just want to mention that Kristen Neff was a past guest on the podcast as well. And it's a really, really phenomenal interview.
Yes, she's phenomenal.
Yes, I would highly recommend the listener to either re-listen, revisit that episode, or to discover a new if we have a new listener.
Yeah, so on the Transformational Leadership podcast, if we'll add that to the show notes, she's phenomenal because she talks about it in the time of the pandemic and what are some tools for these times. So yeah, that would be phenomenal.
That's great. So what's the second tool?
So second tool that I talk about, which is also, mindfulness based, is what I call the mind story map. And it's about looking at, it's a little map. It's a very quick tool where anytime you're feeling a sense of an emotion that is hard or challenging, you take that out. It's a one-pager and you note down what's the emotion I'm feeling and then start to get present to what are the thoughts that are present with this emotion, So it might be a thought around, am I going to lose my job? Or it might be a thought of, does my boss really care about my well-being or not? So becoming really present to the thoughts that are creating those emotions. And once you start to become present to this state, and then also what is the behavior that it's causing, the thoughts and the emotions, what behaviors and actions it's causing, and you start to think about what are the outcomes, then it gives you this ability to take a giant step back and say, wow, this is my mindset right now. And what could be available to me outside of this mindset? it gives you a great tool to get out of those repetitive patterns of behavior and thinking and mindset so that you have new options and choices available.
Is there anything else about the second tool? I'm widely interested in this tool. I would love to explore with you a little more, but I want you to sort of overview all the three tools first.
Sure. So the third tool is what I call the Purpose Accelerator. And the Purpose Accelerator is really about very quickly looking at where is the sweet spot in these three areas. The first area is what are the things that really energize me? The second area is what are my strengths? And the third area is what do my stakeholders need from me? And when you find the sweet spot between all of those three circles, if you will, it really helps you figure out what is a small contribution that I can make during this time of disruption. And what's beautiful about that is when you're focused on your contribution, your energizers, what's fulfilling for you, your strengths, what others need from you, then you're no longer thinking about woe is me. You're now focused on contribution. You're now in the empathic neural network, and you start to get curious and you start to move and take action and learn and become creative.
Is there a way to recognize, I think intuitively, I can sense when I'm in that empathic neuro pathway zone, so to speak, and when I'm in my analytical zone. Is there a way to know for the person and try to shift perhaps?
Yeah. So I think, again, this is very mindfulness based. I think, as you said, intuitively, we know when we're feeling anxious. We might feel it in our chest, for example, or we might feel it somehow in our stomach when we're nervous. We have butterflies in our stomach, right? So it's about, taking a deep breath and getting present to what our body state feels like. Or we might feel frozen, right? In terms of fear. Sometimes a lot of us, when we feel fear, we feel it in a certain place. So becoming really aware of that. And then one of the really interesting podcast interviews that I had was with Amanda Blake. Amanda is a somatic coach. And so I interviewed her. And what she talked about is there are different ways of breathing that you can use because these are body phenomena, right? They're different. The emotions are often caused by different ways that your body is activating stress hormones inside. Then if you breathe deeply, that is a way of activating your parasympathetic nervous system. Or in the podcast interview, she talks about the hot breath, which is you're actually resetting your nervous system so that it resets out of the fight flight into a different mode. You can also meditate. You can ask yourself a couple of questions that really get you into a state of gratitude, like what's already good here? How am I already okay? Self-compassion practice is another great one to shift yourself.
How have you yourself noticed your emotional landscape changes throughout this pandemic? Because I can surely speak about my experience, the beginning of the pandemic, then how my emotions shifted, how I'm feeling now. I'm curious, knowing what you know about all of those tools and the interviews that you have done. I would love to know your personal experience. What are your observations about your own inner world? What changes have you gone through?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And, as I was writing about the Hubler-Ross change curve, what struck me is that it's a beautiful curve and it's obviously really well researched, and that, we experience this roller coaster of emotions, but that we come to some kind of a place of integration and meaning. And I'm sure we do, but I will say that my own emotional state has been a lot less predictable than the Hubler-Ross change curve. It really very much depends on the day. Early on, I will say that as soon as I got the idea of the book, it kind of really propelled me. And I was literally waking up at 5 a.m. in the morning, like just ready to go and start writing and doing research and starting this podcast. It was like it really put me into action. And then I remember once the book was done or almost close to being done, then I would wake up in the morning and I would have this like feeling in my stomach, like, oh my God, I'm putting myself out there. This book is written in 2.5 months. Is it just crazy for me to think that I can write a book? So I was feeling this sense of almost shame and anxiety and, discomfort of putting it out there, right? Like, what if it's all imperfect and wrong and nobody buys it and nobody gets anything from it? And, it's all these normal human emotions that we all have. And so it continues to be a roller coaster.
So how did you get the book idea?
So I had been actually thinking about writing a book. At the end of last year, I was thinking about writing a book focused on disruption because I could see that this whole decade we were going to face disruption. I had no idea, of course, right, that we would be facing it in the US. It was sort of March is when really things started to get heated up. Then I went to the World Economic Forum in Davos this year. And, you have concurrent sessions at the forum. And I happened to walk into a virtual reality experience. And in this experience, we walked into a small room and I was handed a little brown envelope and inside was a seed. And I was going to experience being a tree. And, I love trees. I love to hike. I love to be in nature. And I thought, cool, what would it be like to be a tree? And so you get your virtual reality headset on and they put a backpack on me and we started. And I was under the ground and then I literally felt myself grow. It was almost like this feeling. And then I felt a little tug at my arm and I noticed that a big bird had landed. It was a big parrot and I was in the Amazon rainforest. And at night, as I grew, I could see the canopy of stars right above me. And it was beautiful. And it reminded me of my time in Tibet when I was hiking, getting up, at 3 a.m. in the morning and hiking from our little tea house into the base camp at Everest. And I thought, wow, I just want to capture this image. And then the morning happened and I heard some loggers in the back and then some fire. And it's like a multisensory experience. And I literally felt heat on my legs. And it was the forest being burned down. And I saw the crisis it created among the birds and everything else. That's when the movie ended. And I literally walked out with tears in my eyes. And I thought, we have this decade. We don't have very much, a very long time. And I walked out with a kind of something in my stomach. Literally, I could feel something thinking, what am I doing? What difference am I making? And what are we doing as a collective? And walked out with this sense of conviction that I need to do something. I wasn't clear about necessarily what I needed to do. In this particular book, I knew that I needed to write something that would propel people to make their difference, whatever that difference is for them.
That's incredible. I literally pictured everything you were describing, and what an experience.
Oh, it was beautiful. It was beautiful, and it was also very moving.
Yes, it's really powerful. Did you have after effects, like days later? How did it feel afterwards?
I think that there was always this thought in the back of my head, like I need to do something. And for a while, I went back and forth, like, what can I do that will make a difference? And I think there was also a feeling of helplessness, like I can't do as much as I would want to. And then there was this sense that none of us have the power to do what is really required. Like individually, none of us have that power. And yet we all collectively have the power. And so how do we connect with our own sense of purpose that moves us? How do we connect with what truly energizes us? How do we connect with what we have to offer in terms of strengths and gifts and bring what we can to the table? Because if everyone brings what we can to the table, I think collectively, there is a lot of power we have. And so one of the 5 forms of agility that I talk about is stakeholder agility. It's about how we influence multiple stakeholders, because the problems that we're going to be faced with are collective problems, whether it's the pandemic or climate change or a problem that we're faced with in each of our individual communities, the causes that we care about. These are collective problems. And so how do we learn to care for our ecosystem? How do we expand from my immediate problem that I have to the problem of we? And then how do we get the skills to bring all of these stakeholders together to solve these problems together collectively? And that requires individuals to have skills, to influence others, to work toward common missions that really matter.
This ties in very well with your definition of authenticity, right?
Well, what I talk about in my first book, I'm so glad you said that, because I haven't really even made that connection. It was 5 years ago, right? Yeah, I'm so happy you've made that connection for me. It's the fullest expression of me for the benefit of we that I talk about.
Yes, it just hit me.
I'm so glad we're talking.
I'm like, it's from her first book. It's what you were
Yes.
saying all along, your definition, right?
Yes,
It's so interesting when things come full circle.
They do.
So what thoughts do you have about this connection that you just discovered, or we discovered together with your first book, Wired for Authenticity and Wired for Disruption? So why is it wired? Talk to me about this part, this neuroscientific part of your, it sounds like you strongly believe that we're wired for disruption and for authenticity.
Yeah. So I think the first book, when I talked about being wired for authenticity, what I talked about is that those practices, the 7 practices of authentic leaders that I talked about, is that, these practices are not just right for leadership, but they're actually good for our well-being. When we step into neural states that enable the fullest expression of me for the benefit of we, that those neural states are actually good for our well-being. And when I talk about wired for disruption, it's these same neural states that I'm talking about. These states of connection, contribution, curiosity, creativity. One of the very interesting pieces of research that I did was around trust agility. And it's based on actual blood tests where when we fall into or create states where we can let our guard down and be completely vulnerable and open and trusting of others, it actually helps our own well-being, so that, oxytocin is released in our body and it feels good. It's the same chemical that's released, for example, when mothers breastfeed their babies. And I remember when my baby was little, my daughter, I went back to work after 3 months and she was still breastfeeding. And I would come back from work and, I would be tired and kind of stressed out. And then I would breastfeed her. And literally within 4 minutes, I would be in a state of nirvana. And it's this wonderful oxytocin that was being released. And I was completely relaxed. And I believe we have these hormones that are in our body that are love hormones, that when we love and connect with people in a completely undefended way, that these are good for our well-being. Actually, there's wonderful research that I think I quoted in my first book. It's from the book Love 2.0 by Dr. Barbara Fredrickson. And if you haven't had her on your podcast, please do, because her research is fantastic. It talks about love being micro moments of connection between 2 people. And that, our body doesn't know the difference between the Disney princess, we will live happily ever after love, and the love you feel in this connection that you have with a person for 20 minutes or an hour, where you're completely experience safety and a sense of shared connection and shared intention for well-being of the other.
I should have her on the podcast. It sounds like a fantastic message. That all sounds delicious when we show up authentically with other people and have those connection moments. It deepens our relationships. How can we practice authenticity on a daily basis? What would you suggest? I know from my own experience, ever since doing this podcast, I have to admit that I've been learning and growing from my guests, and I do practice authenticity. And I know you believe authenticity is a practice too. And when I do, when you talked about that trust, when I am unguarded and I show up vulnerably, which is not easy to do, right? It takes courage to show up like that. It feels so amazing, the connection, the flavor of the connection. But yet we avoid that, right? Consciously, we have to remind ourselves to be present and to practice authenticity. I'm curious what practices, what questions, exercises do you have for yourself or you recommend to people that you work with? What's out there? How can someone deepen their practice of authenticity or perhaps start practicing authenticity?
Yeah. So one thing I wanted to share with your listeners is finally the audible version, the audiobook version of my book is out. One of the first things that I did actually at the very start of the pandemic was to record the audio version of the book because I felt like we needed leaders to have this access to another format who probably don't want to read long books. So that audible version of Wired for Authenticity is out, and try it. But let me answer your question. The 7 practices of authentic leaders that I talk about in the book, let me share a little bit each of them. The first is befriend your body. And for anybody who is mindfulness based, so much of what prevents us from being authentic is that, there's something in our body that says, this might require some courage or letting your guard down. And so being able to befriend your body, you're able to listen to your intuition on the one hand, because, authenticity is great, but your intuition will also tell you how safe it is to open up. On the other hand, you can also befriend your body related to taking the right deep breaths when you know that something is the right thing to do, but your body feels nervous. And you can then take some deep breaths to calm your body down and then step into a state of authenticity. So the first piece is befriend your body. The second practice is about staying curious. And it's about really asking open-ended questions and really not coming from a fixed belief or assumption system, but really being open and, starting with a beginner's mind. The third is about letting go. And that practice of letting go is about letting go of the desire to be right, the desire to have control, because in many ways, when you are authentic, you are just here in this present moment and in a state of play with the present moment and the people that you're with you. And you're just responding in a really flexible way. So letting go of trying to control things over which we obviously don't have a lot of control gives you more freedom to just be playful and curious, and letting go of the desire to be right or the desire to necessarily control outcomes that you know that you don't have very much control over anyway. The fourth practice is giving yourself an A. And the A is about accepting all parts of yourself. The parts that obviously we're proud of and accept, and also the parts that we're perhaps shameful about. And it's about the lifelong journey, really. That practice is to just allow the parts of ourselves that are hidden to come to the front because they too have gifts for us. The fifth practice is choose be before do. And this is about really starting to become aware of and ask yourself this question: who do I want to be in this moment that will best serve the collective, that will best serve this moment? And instead of acting from habitual ways of being and behaving, it's about becoming present to choose in every moment or in every situation. What does the wise choice look like instead of acting from habit? The sixth practice is called Face the Dragon, and it's what you were talking about. It's about how can you face your fears? because when we face the fears, we know that a lot of our fears are quite irrational, and it's about turning around and facing them. And then the last and the seventh practice is dancing with the dream. And it's about really connecting deeply with what moves us and our aspirations and what fulfills us. And that doesn't mean you necessarily quit your day job. It means that you find that which moves you and energizes you and bring that into your day.
Excellent. I love all the 7 practices. And I just want to mention that there is an assessment that the listener can take. It's free. It's on your website. How can they find that link for the assessment, for the authenticity assessment?
So we have 2 assessments, actually. The link for the Wired for Disruption assessment, it's a 5-minute assessment, is on my website. It's www.transformleaders.tv/wired for disruption. And that has a 5-minute agility assessment where you can see how you're doing on these 5 superpowers of agility. And then the second assessment is the Wired for Authenticity assessment. And if you go look under tools, you can find that assessment.
Yes, I have taken it, and I think my score was pretty decent. I think the highest is 5, right? It's a sliding scale, I guess, what it's called. I was 4.2 on, I can't remember on what, but I was low on letting go practice. That was my lowest one.
I think it's so true for many of us. We just have to keep letting go.
Have you taken your own assessments?
I have. And it's been a while since I've taken the Wired for Authenticity one. I have to go back and do it again. But I will say that for me, the reason I think about these as practices is because there truly are. Like there is no destination you get to and say, okay, my work is done. I'm fully enlightened now, or I'm fully authentic now. I think it's just a daily practice. And over time, of course, it becomes habit and it gets easier. And, vulnerability, which is something that you were talking about, Anna, gets easier and life becomes more joyful.
Yes. What are some benefits that you have witnessed for yourself by practicing authenticity?
So I think it's about this notion that first and foremost, there is a sense of ease that you have. Because when you're fully anchored and grounded in yourself, that, you're okay and the other person is who they are, and to not take that personally, then it brings a sense of ease in your dealings with people. I have in my daily to-do list, my practice of courage. Every day, I have a little title on top of my to-do list. What's the 20 seconds of courage that I practiced today? And I just, write down, okay, I haven't done my 20 seconds of courage yet. And 20 seconds is all it takes, right? Whether it's for vulnerability, if you need to have a difficult conversation with somebody, it's like you take that deep breath and you say, I'm going to go for it. And it might be a little messy for sure. But if I'm coming from a place of making a contribution or a desire to make something better, then I'm going to just jump into it. And 20 seconds is all it takes.
And how did you measure the 20 seconds? Did you take data on this? I'm just curious.
Yeah, no, I just list, like for me, the 20, like really, if you think about it, anything that you really need to do that requires courage, you just start. 20 seconds is just kind of like a metaphor, right? It's like, it doesn't take long. You just take this deep breath and you go. So I'm on the board of a company, as I shared with you, and we were talking about the CEO's objectives and putting some really strong and stretching objectives related to diversity goals. So the 20 seconds of courage for me, was about how do I really take a stand for stretchy goals, with the CEO around diversity objectives, because this is important. It's important to me. It's important to the organization. It's important to the culture we want to create. So it's about taking a stand.
Somebody asked me in our Facebook community, after listening to the podcast we have done on the topic of authenticity, and there are many, many episodes, we cover from different angles. Somebody asked, I am puzzled, how do I know if I'm my authentic self or not? So what would you say to that person?
Yeah, so that's a really good point. I think what I would say that there are certain markers, and for me, the markers are you being courageous? Are you feeling fulfilled? Are you being connected and in the present moment and aware of the opportunities in the present moment to be curious, be real, and also not be stupid, right? I mean, there's so many people that it's kind of this place of wisdom combined with authenticity, because there are so many people, right? So many of us who believe that authenticity is just me being me, right? So, I might do an interview with somebody and I'm using language that might be quote unquote me, but it may not be appropriate to that situation. And so I may have a very strong opinion and believe that that is me, and therefore I have to express that, but I may not express it as skillfully. In that situation, it's the fullest expression of me, but that other part, which is the benefit of we, is not there. So it's about both. How can I have the fullest expression of me for the benefit of the ecosystem that I'm in?
Yes.
Because the benefit of the ecosystem that I'm in is fundamentally so core, right, to the sense of connection that I feel I need and to serving the whole.
Yes, you can't just go around being a jerk and saying, I'm just being me, I'm just being me. I can see that in our culture these days, this word authenticity gets overused and misused and abused, right? And people take it the wrong way and they say what they think, what they feel, and it gets them into trouble. I love your definition, actually, for the benefit of we.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Hannah, I absolutely adore you. As I said, for years, I wanted to have this opportunity to sit down with you. And, we can never plan, right? As if the timing is right when it's right. So I'm so delighted that you were able to come to the podcast. You said yes to my invitation and my dream came true, right? So thank you so much for being here today. And before we say goodbye, where can the listener find you and get access to your resources, your tools, and your books?
My books are both on Amazon. You can check those out. You can sign up for my blog. It's at www.transformleaders.tv. You can listen to the podcast that I'm doing with amazing experts and people who are being a force for good in times of disruption. And that podcast is on Apple and Spotify and all the other big podcast platforms. It's the Transformational Leadership Podcast with Hannah Anam. And yeah, I would love to hear from you guys. So please connect on LinkedIn. I'd love to connect with folks and stay in touch. I'll be doing a series of LinkedIn Lives. If you're interested in mindfulness, I have a course. I have several courses on LinkedIn. The mindfulness course is actually made free right now by LinkedIn Learning. And there's 250,000 people that have taken that course. And it's about how to manage through challenging times using quick 5-minute mindfulness exercises.
Excellent.
So thank you so much, Anna. It was such a pleasure being with you on this podcast. I loved our connection, and I'm so grateful for you for making the connection between my two books.
Well, I guess that was the takeaway from this episode. That was the highlight. Thank you so much. Again, a virtual big hug to you.
Yes, you too as well. Thank you so much.